I'm just going to add another loop again. And the reason why my models are so clean is because as I clean them as I go. I don't let things kind of slip. And even though I'm not talking about this stage is still just very rough, just blocking things out. But later on, you'll see when we start to cut some details into the bonnet and stuff, that I just clean things as I go. I just make sure the topology flows correctly, and I stick to those laws where I'm getting the topology to flow along the main lines. I'm not trying to do anything out of control or crazy. Often I'll switch between using the show and result mode just to see kind of where things are. Sometimes when you smooth stuff, it just covers things and you don't get a good idea until you block out the topology a bit better. So now I'm just going to draw out that second line. And to do that, what I've just done is I've just gone to vertice mode, hit the cut tool, and then just cut a line along here. So very quickly, you don't even notice it while modeling. It's just kind of like a bang, 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 bang. And then you just back to selecting edge mode. So to undo that, it's you hit 1, you hit T, you cut, you right click, you hit 2, you right click. Oh, sorry, it's bugging out a little bit, and then you select. So it's all just a very quick combination of tools. And then you're dragging out again. So another important piece of information, when you are dragging out from the side, try and make sure you have at least a similar number of vertices flowing along to the point below, if you do have any points below. If you model this line first, the same would apply for down here. Try and keep your polygon distribution, at least when it comes to cars, relatively even. The reason for that is when you're rendering the car, you want the surface to be smooth everywhere. You don't want to add 2 turbo smooth iterations on and there be parts that are still low res. So you can see we've got 2 on here, but there's still parts that are a bit jaggy. So even with 3, it's a little bit off. So I mean, even a good example is when you start out, it's good to use 3 iterations because you do just have more control over matching exactly to the blueprint. Now another thing you can see here is when I'm moving these vertices is that I'm having to move the vertice off the actual blueprint so that when it smooths, it's still lining up to it. So I'm actually focusing on while I'm modeling here, and to you guys, I might just be modeling and because I've got the vertice selected, you're focused on the vertice, but try as hard as possible to focus on the actual white curve here. Because that's what we're trying to match. That's the actual curve of the real car. Okay, you can see from the top now, I'm just going to move this vertice to align with this one here, this one in a similar way, And I'm just going to pull this geometry in all the way. And here you can see is a really bad example of dragging topology out and not working with the way the surface is flowing. So yes, later on we can go in and cut things, but how I prefer to work is that for a scene like this, before moving those points in, what I would do is I would grab this point here and then start getting that to flow along this surface. And I'll scale if I have to. And I'm just trying to get those vertices flowing a little bit more nicely along the surface. And I'm just going to fill that area in now. And take another look. And often you'll see what happens is, and it's a little bit scary at first because you're thinking, holy crap, you know, it's looking good from one angle, but then you go to the side and it's all a mess again. How do I solve this? Well, just, you know, keep things simple. If you have to, and you are a little bit confused about the more messy areas, just work on the areas that are less messy and work your way into those bits. So we know that because we've dragged this vertex out over here, that these points have to be in the center of the mesh. And it's all a bit messy, but what I'm going to do is to clean this is I'm just going to go from the side and I'm just going to flatten it. And all I've done is I've just used the Make Planner tool, and you've got an X, Y, and Z option, and Z will flatten it if you've created a plane on the Z axis when you start. When you hit that Make Planner, it's just going to flatten them. Now what I've done here is to get a baseline for moving these points on the side, I've dragged these points in, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set those so that they're aligned on 0. And now from the side, those points I can use to just guide and get the height right of the car bonnet. And you just start working your way through it, cleaning things up as you go. You can just keep dragging if you want from the side. I'm just scaling it vertically to fit. And you can see we're starting to block out the main shapes of the car, while keeping the geometry still really low. So at this point, I should probably point out that that whole process where you're tracing the main curves of the car and using those as a basic structure for dragging out all the other edge loops applies across the whole car. So where you have the sides, all these main lines here need to have that same process applied to them, where you start out with just that single strip and you block out that and get that locked in, and then from that point you can start kind of filling in all the gaps in the car. So because of the method I use of edge extrusion, it's so powerful. What I can do is at any point in the car I can kind of drag out another loop and use that as a starting point. So here, for example, I've just selected that edge and dragged out 2 polygons. If I select this edge here and delete it, now all of a sudden I've got a brand new face that I can use to start constructing other parts of the car. So as I'm modeling this next strip, I'm going to point out the importance of doing it this way so that your topology does flow with the actual car. You have to remember that when you're modeling in 3D, the parts that are going to be most susceptible to problems and errors are where you've got corners and bevels, and not everywhere but the main areas of the car. So all the areas that you fill in, they're the easiest to get smooth because the polygon distribution is so much larger. You don't have to be so picky about where you put things. You can get away, for example, say if I've got the car here, it doesn't have to, I can have that same edge loop here, and the user's probably not going to be able to tell if I've done anything to the car. Whereas when you get to corners and things like that, all those edge loops have to flow into those areas perfectly or they are going to smooth wrong. So now that I've created that new piece, what I can do is I can just start shaping it, and I've got no structure to how I get to a point where I can start dragging this loop out. So that means I can either just drag and scale to get the size right there, or I could simply select it and move it up. And even though I'm doing that in the perspective viewport, it's making the surface kind of unaligned. Throughout my whole career, when I have worked, I've never done it in that kind of exact way. The difference between that size and, for example, that size is so small that the user is going to have an impossible time distinguishing the difference in size between the two once you've got a smooth mesh. So I'm just going to move it to this point here on the car, just where we know where that bonnet is kicking in, and even though it's not really relevant for this piece, it's just a good starting point. And I can just like I was doing on that first piece, I can just start dragging out now. And you can see here when I've done that, one of the problems is those loops have the same orientation as when I started dragging out. So I need to correct that. And this is what I mean by cleaning up as you go. And just another reminder, if you're wondering how I'm making the material kind of go semi-transparent, and that's just using Alt-X. I think I explained that in the first lesson, but now that I'm using it, it's just good to remind you. Now on these last loops, when I'm dragging them out, you'll notice that it's lower than it's supposed to be. And that's because when you are using Turbo Smooth, these edge points don't include that rounding. They kind of start to go flat and you lose that shape. Whereas if I move that up here and then drag out again, you can see now that shape is actually much closer. So now we've got this new strip on the side of the car, and because we've aligned that from the side view perfectly, or as perfect as we need to at this point anyway, now we can go from above and start getting those lines to properly fit the car. So what you do is, you find the line that you find your starting point, and then all you do is you just start moving them inwards. The reason I'm not moving them left and right is because, like I was explaining at the start of the lesson, when I move it left and right here, say to fit, if I've got it here and these things aren't lining up, and I start going like this to move it, without realizing from the side, I've now changed the height of that point and I need to recorrect it. And I've seen a lot of guys waste so much time. They waste a huge amount of time adjusting something forward, then they go to the top and they'll move it back and kind of here, and then they go back and they keep moving it in directions that don't make sense. So just get your points lined up from the side, make it easy for yourself, and then from the top, all you've got to do is just trace that curve. So just move each point until it's following correctly. And sometimes it's a little bit tricky with blueprints because you're not getting all the detail and you're not getting that visibility. So you do need to go back sometimes and take a look at the reference to make sure that you got hard edges in the correct spots and things like that, because you're not always going to have every single line visible in the blueprint. It's more just an overall guide to give you the proportions of the car, and then from that point on you start looking at photo reference and you start cleaning things up. So we can see on the car here, it gets a little bit tricky because we've got multiple hard points here now. And if we go to the side, from this point, that's actually, if we zoom in, a hard edge. And I need to incorporate that into the mesh. So what I do is I just swap to cut, and I'll just cut that support loop in. And when I do put that support loop in, it's just going to make the surface pinch a little bit there. So I align that pinch up, just quickly adjust the other points to make sure that they're good again. And once again, that's just that constant cleaning. If you see a line's not matching, just quickly move it into place, don't leave it. And this is an example where the blueprint's not lining up perfectly, so you just need to be a little bit more careful about how you're doing things. So even though that piece gets a little bit more complicated, it doesn't actually change the way we're constructing the surface. We're still just trying to get those points into a position where we can construct the main lines of the car. I'm just going to select that whole loop, and I'm going to remove all the selection up until that hard point, because what I want to do now is I want to make sure that that is flat. Now at the moment I've got screen mode enabled, so I'm just going to use Alt and right click and swap back to view mode, and then when I drag these points in, now they're going to be much more flat, and it's going to make it easier to create the rounding that you're seeing on these points. So the next line I'm going to create, I'm just going to do the same thing I did over here and drag out a point and drag out another point and then delete that one. And now we have the exact same setup where once again all we're doing is just dragging out loops, and I'm going to try my best to keep once again the same amount of vertices flowing, because you'll see in a second when I do that later on, I can just go in and simply connect those two pieces together and it's all going to flow. Whereas if I've got geometry that's kind of all over the shop, when I go to connect those pieces, you can see that it's not going to be smooth. So it's cool to note that while I'm building these curves, because we are constructing the topology to fit to the main lines of the car, you end up with a very smooth you end up with accurate topology, because you're not trying to build the whole car first, you're just trying to construct and get the main curves to flow correctly. And when I say flow correctly, I mean they're all in the same strip of geometry. So I can select this loop here, and if I ring select that, it goes all the way at the top. You might see at some point people will drag out like this, and then they start dragging down to fit the car piece in. And what's happened here is now this edge loop doesn't have that continuity, and if I select a loop, it doesn't flow correctly. So I just go straight to the top view and start moving that into place. Now it doesn't matter about the thickness or the width of these lines, because at some point I'm going to go in and refine all of those. And even though in this lesson we're not constructing the whole car, obviously, I'm just trying to show you the main things to be aware of when you are modeling from blueprints. So once again, I'm just going to drag another loop out and delete it. And you'll see I do that pretty much everywhere I go, because even though I'm doing it slowly for the tutorial, in real time, for example, if I was working and I wanted to build this next piece, I would kind of do it like this, where I'd select it, drag, create another piece, remove it, go straight to that edge, rotate, and then just start dragging it out again. And I do it as quickly as possible, so that when I swap to show and result mode, I can just go in and move those points very quickly, and I'm trying to block out all these curves as fast as possible. So the whole reason around this workflow is because when you are working in real time on projects, when you do have all those main curves blocked out smoothly, the finishing off process is actually really quickly. And it got to the point where I was modeling a car in like a day, like the outer shell of the car I was modeling in a day, in probably about 10 hours of just sitting down in one go. And then I'd spend maybe 2 or 3 days after that adding in all the other details, you know, like the rear view mirrors and the rims and the tires and things like that. But the main shell of the car, I'd gotten it down to the point where everything was just happening so quickly, because I knew all I had to do was line the blueprints up and then start tracing those blueprints with flowing topology, and then everything else falls into place. So now that we do have those 2 points flowing, I'm just gonna, before I connect them, I'm just gonna make sure that at the back here they're all lined up, because now we've got to move these points. Just need to fix that orientation at all times. It's going to be quite annoying trying to fix all this stuff, but just make sure that when you are creating these loops, that they are flowing evenly. So don't have them like this. They've all got to be coming out kind of in the direction the normal of the face is going. Make it as even as possible. So I'll sometimes use, it doesn't really matter what tools I'll use, I'll either sometimes go to edge selection mode and then connect a joint in, or I'll just straight up cut it in. But whatever, I mean, the whole point of that is just to do it subconsciously. You're not trying to actively think about what you're doing while you're modeling. You're just using the tools that you need at hand, and you can see the workflow is very simple. It doesn't matter how complicated the curve is, it always abides by that same rule. And if you do come across some complex shapes, for example, let me show you down here, the same rule will apply. Because if I bring the car up, this line here is totally separate from this line. So you don't have to think about how you're going to model all this shape here. All you're focusing on is these main lines, and you're just going to keep that flowing up. You're going to keep that flowing up. You're going to keep that flowing up. And when you do create those lines, it becomes quite easy just to keep polygons flowing out. And then all you've got to do to shape this part inside here is just move a few polygons. But all the detail is on the edges. So another thing to note is when you have straight lines, I'm not going to drag out one point at a time there. Because if I do that, then I'm going to end up with a wobbly surface. It's going to end up like that as an exaggeration. So when you come across straight lines, try and use the minimum amount of geometry possible. And you can see the car at the base here is entirely flat. It's a perfectly flat horizontal curve. So I only need one point along there. But now we get to the issue where I don't have enough support loops to line up to this piece. So that's where I just go in with the cut tool and just cut those in. You can see here we've got a little bit of an issue because I don't have enough geometry to define how it's hitting that point on the blueprint. So that's where we've got a loop coming up vertically here, but we don't have anything to support it down here. So what would make more sense is to use edge constraint toggle, which I've got set to C. And edge constraint toggle is just going to make sure, I've already showed you that in lesson 2, it's just going to keep it snapped to that edge. So when we come across issues like this where we don't have enough topology, we need to make sure we're not changing the shape of this curve. So we use edge constraint toggle, and then once again I can just cut in the correct geometry. We've got a point here, but not here along the surface, so it's probably another point where we can add some detail. And I'm just going to move these points a little bit more over now, because when I added this point, it's changed the shape of this, and now this is out of alignment. So we need to just move that up also. So you can see once again, it's another situation where we don't have enough detail there. So I'm just going to connect a piece in, and then we can align that. Don't worry about pieces like this kind of smoothing out. while you're modeling, if you don't want to see that stuff, what you can do is you can just connect a line down the bottom there and delete that, so you've not actually connected the point, and then what will happen is you'll end up with, you know, two separate points that smooth. And then just another example of that, I can just do the same thing here and delete it. So you can see I almost forgot there that when I dragged this point out from the side, I got a little bit carried away and I started to maybe think about coming back over to this point, but I didn't go to the top and align that. So if you constantly remind yourself that as soon as you drag out the loop on the left to go to the top and drag it out as well, that you're going to make your life a lot easier, because you're not going to add all these points. And what can start to happen is, for example, here now, and this was for me when I was starting out, this was probably the hardest thing to get my head around, and that was knowing how to distinguish between the overlapping parts of the mesh and knowing where they fit inside in terms of the blueprints. So I've got this point here that should be for the line flowing down here, but it's not. So it was very difficult for me sometimes to figure out where things should go. But once again, because we've lined things up from the top, or if you say you've got things lined up from the top here, I know that from the front, I don't need to move that left or right. That's already lined up. So even though that information of where that point should go isn't available on the front of the blueprint, it is available on the top. And you can see we've got that line there. So another issue is when you do come across points of the mesh that are very unaligned in the blueprint, and the areas where that's going to be most common is on these big rounded curves, because it's much harder to interpret the shape of those curves from all angles. And you have to remember that these blueprints haven't been constructed from CAD data like you would possibly get if you were working on a production job. Most of the time though, we will just get the CAD data straight up. But basically these blueprints have been traced from an image, and it doesn't mean they're perfect. So if you do get areas that are a little bit out of whack, just, you know, play with them a little bit and try and find a balance where the curve is smooth. No matter what, at all times, even if the blueprint's a little bit wobbly, like we've got here, see this curve here, it's all a bit out of sync. In reality, that curve isn't going to be as wobbly as that. So if I just hide everything and just leave that, you start to get a pretty good idea of how to start out a model. And this applies to pretty much all models I do. I draw out those main edge loops and then start filling them in. So we're nearly done with the lesson now, and I've kind of gotten across the main point that I was trying to convey, and that was to, when working with blueprints, just to start out with these support lines and to keep going. And I didn't want to go too far into cutting in all the detailed parts and things like that in a single lesson, because it can be quite overwhelming for beginners. But what we will do next is I'll just show you on one part of the car how to kind of start going in and defining those, filling in those gaps, and doing that in a clean way. Now, as you can see, to get to this point where I've blocked out all these points and all these edge loops, there's been barely any tools used whatsoever. And I try and stay consistent with that throughout the whole time while I'm modeling. I don't like to make things more complicated than they are. At the end of the day, all you're really doing is moving around vertices and cutting other vertices. You're adding more information to that. But at the end of the day, it's all very simple. And even though we're getting close to the end of this lesson, I'm going to show you how, when you do block out these points, how you can use those points to keep the flow of the car going. And then in the next lesson, I just decided that it's probably going to be best to show you guys how to start adding in all the finer details. So for example, once I do lay out these geometries, how do you go in and start adding in bevels and cuts and making those things clean? So the next lesson will be dedicated to that, going in and adding in detail and showing you the theory behind how that works at that zoomed in level. Basically, when you're working in 3D, or how I look at things is you've got large scale detail, which is what we're focusing on now, getting those main edge loops correct. Then you've got smaller scale detail, which is the bevels around those main edge loops. And then you've got the extremely small detail, which is going in and cutting in circles and rivets and things like that. So there's only really 3 layers, and each layer has its own little workflow. And if you stick to blocking out the car in one big chunk, you've saved yourself a lot of mental thought because you're not jumping back between those different processes. So what I'm going to do is I've blocked out this line here, but I can see that on the actual car, that surface doesn't come out flat. So because I've got everything selected as a loop here, it makes it very easy for me to just select all those and drag them down. And now from the side, you can see that we've got a new shape. And as usual, try and bring those points to be even. So even though it's still going to be connected between the two here, we don't want those loops to be flat like that. The reason for that is because when the edge is smooth, it's going to pull, and you can see there it's starting to pull already. So what the best thing you can do is to have those points and let them flow along the edge adjacent to the normal in which they sit on. Okay, so what I can do here is I'm just going to cut a little bit more detail into this corner, because I can tell I'm probably going to need more detail there anyway. And remember, we are just starting out with the car here. You're always going to have a much likelier chance of adding detail as opposed to removing it. And because this is a small corner, I just want to make sure that I've got enough control loops there where it's not super detailed, but that it's not so low res where I'm limited to what I can do with the geometry. So now that I've got that piece, what I'm going to do is I've connected this piece, and now I'm just going to go in and think about how to get this flowing correctly. So before I do that, I'm just going to grab this piece, and I'm just going to merge those two together, because that's a good starting point where you can see on the car, if I bring the car up again, that line flows and it's got a bit of an angle to it. So you can see if I draw over the top of that, the topology is going to go around like that. This loop's going to come up like that. And then we're going to have lines coming off that. And this point here is where it all happens. That point here. So now I can connect maybe a couple of loops in between here, and I can join this piece, and now you can see it's starting to flow, and we're starting to connect those dots. So now, because I've got all those loops connected, I can just merge those together and start to go in, and I'm just going to put constraint toggle on, so we're not changing the orientation from the top. It's still flowing along there. Because you'll notice, just like I was saying earlier, if I turn off edge constraint and start moving this surface in, you see what happens is it ends up going out of sync. Whereas if I turn edge constraint toggle on and move, it flows correctly. I can just add a point in here because I want to connect these two. And just like this point comes up, so does this one. So we connect this point, and then we're left with, once again, another nice flowing surface. So I'm just going to select this geometry and then select the car geometry and hide everything else and go from the front, because I'm just going to try and make sure that this curve is matching to this point here. And like I was saying earlier, this is going to take a little bit of getting used to, but views like this, where you're seeing all sorts of stuff and crap overflowing and you can't tell where things are going or what they're supposed to look like from this view, it just takes a little bit of practice to get used to that process, where your brain kind of knows what the wireframe looks like from different angles, so that when you are moving these points, you memorize kind of what it looks like here. But while you're starting out, and I take this for granted a little bit, I just kind of zoom in and start working because I know what that shape looks like from the side. But really, you might need to work from this type of view so that when you're moving the point down here, you're also seeing it being adjusted here. So you notice I've got a little bit of a problem area here where this joint isn't flowing through, and it's a little bit messy of me to do that, and that just comes with experience, knowing kind of what I can get away with. But for now, and during the start of this course, I'm going to try and get you to stick with using clean topology at all times, just because you need to have that conditioned in you so that when you are working on projects in real production, you're not going to stick to like bad habits. So we can just keep going along there and filling in those gaps. And you might be thinking to yourself, but the geometry is so messy, like how is that ever going to work? Well, the whole reason behind this workflow is that when you do build those loops, you're starting to see now that the topology has to kind of behave cleanly, because you're adhering to laws that define the way the surface itself is constructed. You're not just randomly putting loops everywhere. You're not randomly trying to fill the surface with detail. So even though parts like this are messy, and we can just start cleaning those up now and getting them a bit more even. And you'll see later on, even though we've got not much detail here, later on in the course, when I start to add detail, it just becomes very quick after that point. The modeling process actually gets quicker, and you start seeing things in a different way. So it really doesn't matter that those lines are not flowing that nicely. But then there's points where you come to a crossroads where you need to add detail, but it might not be beneficial to have that detail flowing in. And sometimes it's best, say for example here, where you just cut out from a point and then add that detail in that way. And then also what I do is, and this is where I'm saying I know what I can get away with as an artist, is if I remove that point now, and let me just make this surface a little bit shinier, because the shader I've got at the moment isn't that shiny, and I'll make it a little bit darker so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. we've got a 5-sided point here, but it's actually smoothing really well. And the geometry is as low res as possible. And if I were to keep modeling, you'd start to see how this all the topology and everything starts to look really beautiful because it is flowing correctly. Of course, later on, I will get into showing you some of those advanced tricks where you can use 5-sided polygons and things like that to create certain effects. But please remember that even though that might appear messy to you, just as a reminder, once again, you're actually modeling with a subdivided version of the mesh, which does have all quads. And so when you see the subdivided mesh, that point actually smooths itself out quite a bit. So that wraps up the first part of kind of diving into working with blueprints. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to go in and approach the next level of detail, which is those things like bevels and working out all the corners. So if I just bring up the reference, we'll go in and I'll start teaching you how to cut in details like this. We'll start making a few, ridges in the car. And I've never really been a fan of just seeing tutorials that are just like, okay, we're going to model a gun now. I always think there should be a bit more theory behind what you're doing. So it's not even really about modeling the car, to be honest here. It's more about getting you to understand that when you create those main defining edge loops, everything else around that is going to fall into place so much easier. Like I can't even stress enough how much easier this makes the whole modeling process. If you have the main structure set up and you've got the main proportions set up, everything else is basically just like filling in puzzle pieces. It's not that hard. Yes, we're going to get into the technical side of cleaning up that geometry, and that's the hardest part, but laying out clean, solid loops isn't as hard as people make it out to be. Topology in itself will flow around the surface. So just lastly, before I go, I just wanted to let you know now that obviously the new website's all done, and I've been working really hard on that for the last month. And while I was injured with my nose, I was working on the site most of the time because I couldn't actually record lessons. And I just want to apologize. Obviously this month has been a little bit crazy with trying to catch up, and there's been quite a big expansion of students on the course, and with that comes a lot of customer support. And up until this point I was handling it quite well, but in the last couple of weeks I was getting so many support emails where I couldn't keep up with actually responding to that while at the same time working on the course. So I made a kind of executive decision to just say, screw it, we're just going to get the website up and working, so that if you need to use the forums, which you can now access on the course page, or if you need notifications, or I need to send updates to people or provide new news, it just makes things so much easier for me. So I do apologize for the lesson being delayed a few times. I know I said I'd release it and that kind of got pushed back, and similar things happened with the V-Ray course when I started, and it's a little bit of a weakness of mine. I don't do it intentionally, and part of that comes from because I get so many emails a day of people really excited for new lessons and asking me when it is. Sometimes that pressure gets to me, and I try and over deliver, and it doesn't always work out for the best. But as the course does continue, I'll always try and improve that, and it's never my intention to kind of leave you guys hanging. But if I do, I'm going to try and make it up to you somehow, some way. Thanks heaps, and I really appreciate all the support you've given me so far. It's been a pretty big journey getting to this point, but now that the new website is there, I'm really looking forward to kind of building up a community with you guys and getting to know your work and like what you expect to achieve on the course. And I will be there on the forums to help you out with that. If you were starting a new project, feel free to share work in progresses. I'm happy to help you out with wireframes and drawing topology for you, and just in general, just trying to be an instructor that can actually help you achieve the goals you want. Thanks heaps guys, and I'll see you next lesson. I'm going to try and get that out as soon as possible. I'm a little bit tired, but I'm going to jump straight into that next lesson where we're going to be working on detailing up parts of the car.